The Black Death is a complex topic. Even today, we still aren't 100% sure how it spread. Was it rats or fleas? Was it trade or mutation? Was it an airborne variant or poor hygiene? As academics argue amongst themselves, they fail to realize that none of these sources are mutually exclusive. They all could play a part. Today, we're looking at some of the theories, experiences, and responses taken in the 14th and 17th century to the Black Death, and hopefully tickling your fancy for my new series, Horror Histories. The Black Death is known by many names: Yersinia pestis, pestilence, the bubonic plague, the Great Plague, and the Great Mortality. There have been a number of plagues in the past, from the first known plague in 541 to 549 in Rome, up to the 17th century. But it is the bouts in the 14th century which will be the focus of today's video, the one which sprung from Asia and ruptured European society, its culture, and its economy. As far back as the 14th century, there have been many conspiracy theories into how the plague spread through Europe and Asia, such as germs of disease looming in ponds and pools of stagnant water and marshlands, a punishment from God for man's failure to meet biblical expectations, and even the Jewish community polluting drinking water. Whatever the cause, it didn't really matter, for the disease had firmly embedded itself in the bowels of society. But where would we be without an origin story? Much like COVID, the plague began with wild vermin. As humans came into contact with wild rodent colonies in the mountains, the pathogen mutated into a more virulent form. Pockets of plague appeared in Europe as contact with rodent communities in the Alps became inevitable, and an endemic swept across the Chinese province of Hebei, claiming 90% of its population. On swift wings, the plague would spread throughout Asia via fleas, lice, and trade routes. However, there is an untold story few have heard. One which really kick-started the pandemic in Europe in 1347, and what can only be classed as an early form of bioterrorism. It starts with the story of Kaffa of Genoa. Located in the Crimean peninsula of the Black Sea, Kaffa came under siege of the Tatar forces of Kipchak Khan Yanibeg, the grandson of Genghis Khan. The hope was to remove the Genoese as a cornerstone of Europe's defence against the East and a dominant East-West trader. As Yanibeg's army was overcome with pestilence, in a final act of warfare in his lost war, Yanibeg ordered plague-infested bodies be catapulted over the fortified wall and into the city. Already reduced to squalor by the siege, the Genoese city was quickly decimated by the disease. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, ships of the supposed untainted fled to Venice. Little did they know, the plague bubbled in their bowels. Gabriele de Musi, a notary, gave a vivid account of the plague in Kaffa and Sicily. Tell, O Sicily, and ye, the many islands of the sea, the judgments of God. Confess, O Genoa, what thou hast done, since we of Genoa and Venice are compelled to make God's chastisement manifest. Alas, our ships enter the port, but of 1,000 soldiers, hardly 10 are spared. We reach our homes, our kindred and our neighbours come from all parts to visit us. Woe to us, for we cast them the darts of death. Whilst we spoke to them, Whilst they embrace us and kiss us, we scatter the poison from our lips. Going back to their homes, they in turn infect their whole families, who in 3 days succumb and were buried in one common grave. Priests and doctors visit the sick returned from their duties ill, and soon were numbered with the dead. O death, cruel, bitter, impious death, which thus breaks the bonds of affection and divides father and mother, brother and sister, son and wife. Lamenting our misery, we feared to fly, yet we dared not remain. As the disease found a home in Europe, the symptoms of the plague were hard to disguise. Signs the host had been condemned to an early grave. Symptoms such as fever, vomiting, coughing blood, uncontrollable spasms, black pus-filled pustules, and with them the lingering stench of death. The plague did not discriminate, taking the rich and the poor, the old and the young, the rural and the urban. But with overcrowding in cities and the streets filthy and awash with sewage, it created the perfect environment for the plague to flourish, and the poor were disproportionately affected. The mere touching of clothes appeared to itself communicate the malady of the toucher. Both the plague of the 14th and 17th century saw the street lined with the dead, and the air thick with the malodor of death. Approximately a third of Europe's population and 2/3 of Asia were eradicated by the plague. Some cities lost nearly all its inhabitants. The sheer number of corpses saw mass graves being excavated across many cities, as they could no longer cope with the volume of dead on everyone's doorstep. And I, Agnoli de Tori, carried with my own hands my 5 little sons to the pit, and what I did, many others did likewise. The plague left many susceptible to other diseases and contaminants, such as anthrax spores, caused by exhuming mass graves, and fleas continued to spread the grief as septic build-up festered in its belly and vomited the rot into open wounds, passing on the disease. The ferocity of the Black Death was matched only by the velocity of its rampage across the continent, and with it, the questionable belief in the supremacy of the Catholic Church. With many suffering under the sting of pestilence, the Catholic Church no longer held its sway. With the depopulation and deregulation of society, it meant smaller congregations, and the perceived punishment from God meant the clergy were not as superior after all. At one point, the plague led to the intensification of religious belief and practice. Many patrons resorted to archaic and religious means of healing, such as bloodletting, which is the cutting of the vein in the neck and the arm to allow bad blood to run freely. They also indulged in boil lancing, bathing in urine and dung, sleeping with dead sheep, and adding herbs to beverages. Oddly enough, no mention of toilet paper. With seemingly no reprieve, new universities and colleges rose, undermining the Church's languishing authority, and many turned their backs on the Church, leading to the Reformation, which saw the split of Christianity in the 16th century. This disruption saw the rise in medical knowledge as doctors tended to the sick and preached against ancient medical doctrine of the Church. They taught the public that the plague was not divine retribution, but rather a contagion. And in 1377, we start to see the first implementation of social distancing and quarantines in areas such as Ragusa's ports. But it also brought a more recognisable figure into play: the plague doctor. The long cloaks and grotesque bird-like masks ensured a visit from the plague doctor was a frightening sight. Despite the sinister overtones, Misconceptions about how the disease spread inspired the design of the attire. Credited to Charles Delorme, a physician to the royals, the coat was lined with scented wax. Their clothing covered them from head to toe and was often made of leather. They walked with a rod that allowed them to poke and fend off the diseased. And the mask contained herbs thought to help cover the reek of putrid flesh and purify the air of the miasma, fumigating plague-stricken areas and protecting the doctor. Of course, it was probably more the lack of physical contact and interaction which saved most, more than the wax and the perfumed herbs. While time eventually saw the development of the germ theory of disease, Europe would see centuries of death, suffering and squalor as the effect of the plague ebbed and waned. Today, we still find the evidence of the horrors of the 14th and 17th century as graves are unearthed, but recent times have shown we've learned little from the past, and thus we're poised to repeat the worst of history.